Darth Kermit here with an Eve Echoes video on adaptive hardeners versus reactive hardeners. To make math and demonstration easier, I'm going to use shield hardeners even though I'll be flying a Myrmidon. Before we start, please like, share, subscribe, and/or leave a comment if you like my videos. Okay, so first thing, here's the base resistances of the Myrmidon's shields. 0, 20, 40, and 50. We're going to be using Meta Level 5 Hardeners. The adaptive has resistances of about 32% across the board, while the reactive only has about 16% across the board. So the adaptive is twice as effective. If that's the case, what's the point of reactive? The two types of hardeners do the same basic thing in two fairly different ways. Adaptive hardeners provide a fixed resistance boost to all resistances. In this case, 32% to each resistance. So any damage that gets through your base resistance is reduced by a further 32%. Reactive hardeners, on the other hand, have a fixed resistance pool that gets divided proportionally across all incoming damage types. In this case, 64% total. Any damage that gets through your base resistance would be further reduced by 64%. Sounds great, right? The problem is that there are no weapons that only do one type of damage. Lasers, decomposers, and railguns each do 2 different types of damage. Cannons do 3 different types of damage, and missiles do all 4 types of damage. So let's say you're taking damage from lasers. What happens is the reactive armor splits its pool of 64% between the 2 damage types. In the case of lasers, this means EM and thermal. Well, wouldn't this just mean 32% each and we'd be just as well off with adaptive then? Fortunately, no. Because except for missiles, the different weapons don't do damage evenly between their damage types, and the reactive hardener splits its pool proportionally. For lasers, 62% of the damage is EM and only 38% is thermal. So the reactive hardener splits its resistance pool the same way, 62% to EM and 38% to thermal. This comes out to 40% resistance to EM and 24% resistance to thermal. To illustrate with a completely unrealistic hypothetical, let's say you have 1000 laser damage coming in and no resistances but one of the hardeners. The laser is doing 620 EM damage and 380 thermal damage. With the adaptive hardener, you reduce each damage type by 32%, so you would take 422 EM damage and 258 thermal damage for a total of 680 damage. With the reactive hardener, you would reduce EM damage by 40% and thermal damage by 24%, taking 372 EM damage and 289 thermal damage for a total of 661 damage. About 20 points of damage less. That's another 2% of total damage, or about a 6% improvement in damage reduction. This isn't huge, but this is a game where every percent counts. Plus, reactive hardeners are way cheaper than adaptive. So for shields, if you're doing encounters and you know you're only going to be taking 2 types of damage, the reactive is slightly better. In every other situation, adaptive is way better. And if you have the ISK, just go for adaptive and you'll likely be happier anyway. Even if you want to use 2 hardeners, you should probably just do 2 adaptives. But for armor, it's slightly different. Reactive armor hardeners have a much more significant edge when only taking 2 types of damage. Theoretically, as much as 41% more damage reduction than adaptive. Realistically, it'll only be about 10 to 20% extra reduction, but that's still pretty significant. And if you want to use 2 hardeners, it's probably best to use 1 of each. If you want an explanation of the armor hardeners, keep watching for more unnecessary maths. There's 2 major differences between shield and armor hardeners. 1, armor hardeners are overall far less effective than shield hardeners. This is partially made up for by the fact that most ships have higher base armor resistances than shield resistances. 2, adaptive armor hardeners are only 50% more effective overall than reactive instead of twice as effective. This means reactive armor hardeners have a higher relative effectiveness. So our Meta Level 5 armor hardeners have the following resistance boosts. 19.13% across the board for the adaptive, and 12.75% across the board for the reactive, which gives the reactive a total pool of 51%. Using our previous example of 1000 incoming laser damage, the adaptive would reduce the incoming damage to 501 EM and 307 thermal for a total of 808 damage. The reactive would reduce it to 424 EM and 306 thermal, totaling 730 damage, a difference of nearly 80 damage, or 8% of total damage, or a 41% increase in damage reduced. So against lasers, railguns, and decomposers, reactive is definitely worth using. And against cannons, unlike the reactive shield hardener, the reactive armor hardener is only slightly less effective than adaptive. So it could be worth keeping one of these fitted unless you know you're going up against missiles, especially if you want to use 2 hardeners, where the penalty for using a second adaptive, while minor, is enough to make a second adaptive less effective than a reactive. And even against missiles, a second adaptive is only slightly more effective than a reactive. Now, there's one more advanced topic to cover before I go. If you use reactive hardeners, then you want to avoid the hardener skills. This is because reactive hardeners only react and adjust damage resistances when they activate. And the skills increase their activation time, meaning they react less often. The hardeners use so little capacitor that you really don't need the benefits of the skills anyway. And with that, I wish you all safe travels out in the black. Till next time.